How many of you have ruined good pots with bad handles? I definitely have, and for the longest time I used to avoid pulling handles like this at all costs. Nowadays though, it's a process I relish, and in this video I'll be going through the procedure of attaching and pulling a handle on a new shape with minimal tools. In fact, all I use is a serrated kidney, some slip and a brush, and a basin of water, warm of course in these wintry months. This warm water used for pulling doesn't need to contain clay like mine does, but this is it essentially: water, slip and a kidney. And of course clay and the mugs you've made. And for this, perhaps more than anything, I wear an apron, as when pulling handles it's very easy to cover yourself in slip and water, and sometimes you need to be able to dry your hand very quickly, which you can do on your apron, but I normally keep a small towel next to me for this. Pulled handles can be really strong, as the way the clay is attached to the cup is quite forceful compared to handles that are pre-shaped and then attached to the cup. It's for this reason that when sherds are found at archaeological sites, you'll often find pulled handles still attached to the pieces of wall they were joined onto, as the join itself is often stronger than the actual walls of the pot, which is certainly the case with my work, as the handles are often thicker than the walls themselves. As for the clay I'll be using for the handles, I need it to be not too firm and not too soft, or about the same consistency as what you'd throw with. I take a good handful, pat and wedge it up, and roll it into a shape that looks like this. It should taper slightly from the top to the bottom, and if you find this is too much material to work with, there's absolutely nothing wrong with using less. The cups the handles are going to be attached to are on the firm side of leather hard, and when held they shouldn't feel sticky, nor should the shape easily deform if you gently squeeze the cup. This goes for the rim especially, which should be able to hold its shape, remaining a nice circle if gently pressed. If your pots are too soft when you attempt this, the force needed to push the handle onto the cup can easily distort it, so catching these cups in the right condition is crucial to the process of pulling handles. With my left hand, I grip the lump of clay at the top. I even press in with my fingertips to create a groove so that I can grip the lump of clay more easily. I then soak my right hand in the basin of water and begin stretching out this length of clay. As soon as I feel my hand or the piece of clay drying out, I fetch more water, and I also make sure I work directly over the bowl of water, as it will catch much of the mess pulling handles creates. I squeeze close to the top of the lump of clay, pinch with my thumb and index finger predominantly, and then drag that down the length of clay quickly. As the strand of clay gets thinner and longer, I change the grip of my hand, creating a smaller gap, which means the clay is progressively extruded and made thinner. It helps to work quickly as you're doing this, and if you find there's a thickness building towards the end, you can either just snip it off, like so, or just release your grip before you get to that point, as otherwise, if this bulge gets too large, your hand will collide into it and the entire length will be torn off. The shape of this initial length really depends on the types of handles you're going to make. If I were making smaller handles for espresso cups, I'd pull a much thinner, narrower length, and if they were larger handles for jugs or teapots, I'd make sure these are thicker and wider. But for these handles, which are going to be relatively thin, this thickness works. They're about 2 centimeters wide, 7 or 8 centimeters long, and about a centimeter thick. I lay the length out against the edge of a table or a wearboard or anything that has a sharp edge, and I snip them off using the side of my thumb, laying them side by side, touching as equally as I can. With this single length, I was able to get about 11 consistent handles. But if you're just beginning to learn this skill, if you can get 1 or 2 or 3, that's also completely fine. You absolutely don't need to aim for 10 or 11 like I do. And with time, as you get better at pulling, you'll be able to make longer, more consistent lengths, which ultimately helps to speed the process up. Now, you can also use an extruder to make these initial blanks. You can even roll a coil of clay out on the workbench and cut it into smaller segments. The reason I prefer to pull them is that the blanks created are pretty much half formed already, and I'd argue that I'm more capable of creating consistent lengths like this as opposed to rolling out a coil. It also means I'm not reliant on an extruder to make my handles for me, nor is there a piece of equipment I have to tidy up afterwards. I'll be attaching these handle blanks immediately to the cups, and I want them to remain in this soft state for as long as possible, so they're placed on plastic so the wooden surface doesn't draw moisture out of the bottom of them, and it also means I can wrap them up as the day goes on, which works especially well in the hotter months. In some cases, I'll even spray them with water throughout the day. When they're soft like this, they're much easier to blend into the cup, and it's also easier to create the flare I need on one end of them. To do this, I place the handle blank into my palm, held gently in place with my thumb and fingers. Yet, the blank needs to be held in such a way that it extends past your grip just a touch. I then carefully clasp my fingers around it, not firmly enough to create any indentations in the length, but enough to keep it in place. I then tap the extended portion, first on one side, then it's turned over, and I do the same thing to the other side. This creates a portion of clay that flares out, with which I'll be able to easily blend the length of clay into the body of the cup without removing any material from the length itself, weakening it, or adding an extra coil of clay around the join, which is something you often see, and it adds another fiddly step to the process. Whereas if this handle blank is offered up to a flat surface, all that I need to do is blend in this flared section. But before I can do that, I first need to prepare an area on the cup for the handle to be joined onto. And for this, I use the serrated kidney to roughen up a patch that's approximately the same size as the flared out portion of clay. It's also worth noting that throughout this process, especially after the pot has been scored, I wipe clean the area I place the cup on, as otherwise these burrs of clay will stick into the base of the pot. The scored section is then dabbed over with slip, which fills the grooves left by the serrated kidney. This softens that portion of the wall so it more closely matches the lump of clay being stuck onto it. I place the fingers of my left hand inside the cup to brace the wall and really very firmly push the length of clay against it, which has to be done in such a way that the actual length isn't deformed too much, and you definitely don't want to create any thin patches. Once attached, I squeeze back over the handle like so, redefining the shape and making it more even, and spreading out some of that clumped up material very close to the mug back into the length. You can see how that flared out portion I created spreads out on the side of the cup as the clay is pushed against it, and now I can easily just blend this material into the body, which I do with a dry finger all the way around, creating a very flush and strong join. For the top and bottom, I blend by dragging my fingertip over it, like so. And then I tidy up with the tip of my thumb, really working the clay in, with fingers still kept opposite this area inside the pot to brace it. And you should, if done correctly, be able to really shake the handle without it falling off. Now to get started with the real pulling and shaping, I begin by dipping the handle in the water, and then just like before, I squeeze the length from the top, pinch and pull down quickly, working the length from both sides so that it keeps a nice oval cross section. If instead I only pulled from one orientation, I'd end up with a handle that's lopsided, with it being thicker on one side and thinner on the other, so keeping your hand moving and swapping sides is crucial. With the length almost there, I use the tip of my thumb just to pinch out the last of the excess thickness at the top, whilst being very careful not to pinch too much, as creating a thin spot right at the join is very easy. I'm also using a slightly drier hand to do this, actively removing much of the slip that coats the outside of the handle, as this creates a length that's better at holding its shape. I then use my thumb to change the angle which the handle protrudes from the cup so it springs up and away from the form rather than sloping immediately down. I then lightly take the end of the length and angle both it and the cup down together, looping the handle into place in a graceful arc. I make sure the handle is straight and press it into the tapering base before pinching the excess away. Due to the angle this part of the handle attaches, I can blend this clay in very firmly, which means it doesn't have to be scored or slipped, and just like with the top join, I spend a few moments making it flush, so that it looks like it blends naturally into the cup. In fact, that's what I like so much about pulled handles like this. They look as if they've grown from the cup, as if they've always meant to be there, and once this object has been covered in glaze and fired, it'll unify it even further. If the top of the handle isn't curved enough for my liking, I'll use a wetted finger to push up and then in, so it has more of a spring to it. You have to be careful doing this, and in some ways it's better to wait 10 to 15 minutes for the handle to firm up somewhat, as when the clay is really soft like this, it's very easy to make a mistake, and for the handle to simply come off or be deformed in some way that ruins its pulled aesthetic. I use a wetted finger to wipe away the more prominent finger marks, and that's the handle finished for now, although I will be doing a bit more finessing after it's turned leather hard. But for now, they're placed upside down so the arced handle doesn't lose its shape by slumping downward gradually as it dries. I want the handles of these to spring right from this indent here, as compared to a previous version I made, where the handle placement just seems off. It's too low on the body of the cup, and it feels unbalanced. The proportions are off, and so far, even with only one of these new mugs made, they already feel much more intentional. The mug is scored and slipped, and once this has been done, I don't leave the pot for long, as the thin wall will become very soft very quickly after being covered in wet clay. So it's scored and slipped, the handle is tapped out like so, and it's immediately attached. And once again, these blanks are soft. I don't let them sit out and dry before attaching them, as when this clay is soft and easily malleable, it's easier to blend it into the cup and form it into an elegant, flowing shape once joined. The length of clay is pushed firmly onto the cup, which can cause material to gather in a thick lump right by it, so it's carefully squashed back to even it out. And even really is the key word here, as any indentations or irregularities will make pulling the thinner, final shape very hard. It's then smoothed into the body, and I can take my time doing this. It's really the next step once the length is wetted again and pulled further, where it helps to work relatively quickly. If I were to spend 10 minutes doing this, getting the handle wetter and wetter, and really oversaturating the clay to the point that it loses all of its strength, then when looped and attached to the bottom of the mug, you may find it very troublesome getting the handle to keep its shape. The same goes for your strokes. If you move your hand really slowly, it's actually more difficult to maintain constant pressure, and your hand and the length of clay will dry out more quickly. I then switch to using my thumb to pinch away the excess at the top of the join right close to the mug, evening out the strap and making it less cumbersome. I then dry my hand so it isn't slippery when I grip the end of the handle and loop it into place. Just like when you're learning to throw pots, the first 100 you make won't be very good, and you should expect the exact same thing when it comes to pulling handles. And if all you want to do is practice this method, throw a number of thick cylinders, pull handles all the way around them, cut them off, and go again, and again, and again. Your 10th attempt will be so much better than your first, and your 100th attempt will be on a different level compared to your 10th. And soon enough, the handles you make will match the pots you've made. Although I do something which is relatively unorthodox. Not with all my handles, but with some, and that's carve them once they're leather hard, to create handles that are really thin and fine, that you could probably never create by pulling alone. It adds a considerable amount to their creation time, but on shapes like this I think it makes a huge difference, and it gives the pots a much more elegant profile. Occasionally, when I'm pulling handles, and one does get too wet and struggles to keep its intended shape, I'll still attach it at the bottom and blend it in like normal. Then I'll head over to where I keep my heat gun and give it a quick blast. I can then move it back into its intended shape without it deforming and sagging downward. And with the heat gun I use, I only need to blast it for about 5 to 10 seconds on its most powerful setting, and I keep the paint stripper moving constantly so I don't heat one spot for too long, as it's that which will cause things to crack or move as it's forced dry too quickly. Now, as I'm joining soft clay onto leather hard clay, how I dry these out hereafter is very important, as if this process is rushed, most of the handle joins will crack, as the two parts continue drying out at different rates, which means my aim is to get the entire pot, handle and cup the same consistency before I begin drying them out properly. And to do this, I first spray them liberally with water, and then I wrap them up tightly, sealing both ends with a heavy kiln prop, and I'll leave them like this in this enclosed, humid atmosphere for 1 or 2 days. This way the handle and the cup can acclimatise to one another, becoming the same level of firmness, and it's only once that's happened that I'll unwrap them, carve and finish the handles, and then once again I'll continue to let them dry slowly beneath plastic, as rushing this really is the worst thing you can do. Here's a batch of these mugs I handled a few days ago, and they're now firm enough to be carved, together with the bottoms of the mugs being double checked for any debris that might be stuck into them or any scratches that may have occurred as the pot was moved around on the workbench. There's a thickness around the join above the handle that I want to get rid of, and I also want to make the curve inside the handle, especially towards the top, perfect. so I rest the cup on my knee and remove a tiny slither at a time with a sharp paring knife. It's slow going and each cup is a little different, and I imagine if I were to make 500 more of these, I could get them to the point where they barely needed any refinement. But I quite enjoy this process, despite it being very easy to make a mistake, cutting away more than I'd like, but I'm getting better with time. Once gone over with a knife, I use a sponge on a stick to fettle over the carved areas to even out and smooth the surface. I also try my best not to carve away any of the more prominent marks left by my fingers and thumb, as it's these that give the handle so much character. The last thing I do is use a wetted finger just to burnish these areas, to compress any coarse specks of sand back into the body, as rubbing over the stoneware with a sponge creates quite a rough surface. And the real final step is to place the mug over a solid clay chuck to double check the base. And usually this means just burnishing over the foot with a metal kidney. And then I push the mug down against the chuck. This forces the rim round if it has in any way been misshapen through the handling process. And here's how one of the finished handles looks. It's a bit more petite and there's less weight in the top portion of the join, and it's already at this point very comfortable to hold. There's enough space within the handle for two of my fingers to fit without feeling cramped, which is good as this space is only going to get smaller as the pot dries out and is fired. Carving the interior shape means the curve inside is really lovely and smooth. I like it when the edges of my handles match the finesse of the rim of the cup. Hopefully this will encourage the glaze to break in a certain way on both of these points, thus unifying the glaze effect on the vessel even more. But I suppose most importantly, the handle now feels balanced and proportionally right, and the base is now lovely, smooth and crisp. All in all, this final step adds about 4 or 5 minutes to each mug, which is considerable, and that will be reflected in the overall price of these compared to the normal mugs I make. The lot are then placed upside down and are wrapped once again for another day or so, after which they'll be fully unwrapped and set out to dry. Thanks as always for taking your time to watch. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like and subscribe. It would mean a lot. And I'll see you next time.